Looks like we're live. What's going on? Live, but this is private. So um, today we're going to continue with the poetry unit. And I want to introduce you to a poet we'll be talking quite a bit about. We'll read probably three or four of his poems. He is famous for a number of reasons. I mean, he writes great poetry, and he writes poetry that is still relevant today, even though he was writing about 100 years ago. It's still things that can resonate, to use a word we've had already. And I'll also use Renaissance. We've had that before too. Um, Poems that I hope will still resonate with you because he wrote for people like us, common everyday people. He didn't write for people who were studying in a college or a university. He wrote for us. And one of my favorite poems of all time is by him. It's called "The Dream Deferred." Can't wait to share that with you. But before we get into any of his poetry, I think it's important to learn about the times that he was living in. This isn't important for all poets. Sometimes it is. It is good to, or writers, sometimes it is good to know a little bit about what was going on in the world as they were writing, what was going on in their life, some of their background. But for Langston Hughes, I think it is pretty important because his experience in the early 1900s might be different from someone who was white because he was black. And it wasn't that long ago that, of course, maybe 50, 60, 70 years before, a lot of people who were black were enslaved. So he wrote during a time called the Harlem Renaissance. And Harlem is a part of New York. It's one of the boroughs of New York. And a lot of people of color gravitated towards this part of the world. Although people of color were not called people of color back then. And one of the reasons why I want to watch this with you is explain one of the words that they kind of just throw around. But yeah, the Harlem Renaissance was a time when if you were black in this country, you probably didn't have a lot of rights. If you remember from social studies class, when we talked about the 14th Amendment, there were these things called Jim Crow laws. So if you were black in certain parts of the country, you definitely didn't have as many rights as somebody who was white. The typical, the water fountain, separate water fountains. It was a lot deeper than that, separate schools. I talked quite a bit about that during the 14th Amendment video that I hope you watched for social studies class. But starting during the Harlem Renaissance, so remember, Renaissance, rebirth, a rebirth. So it was like the first time in this country that if you were black, you could have a voice. And there were a whole group of people that moved to this borough of New York City called Harlem. There were musicians there were writers there were poets there. So it was probably the first time I think in this country, if you were black, like you had a little bit of freedom, a little bit of freedom. And you could reach a wider audience, which is talked about in this biography. Langston Hughes was, definitely was black, but it's not like he was just writing poetry that would only resonate with you if you were black. He was trying to write for everyone who had a dream, who was suffering, who felt injustice. So let's get into a little bit of this. I think I can play it with no problem, and I'll let it play for the most part, but there might be a couple places where I want to stop it. Sure.
Langston Hughes is considered a great author because he spoke to, for, and about Black people in America.
Poet, novelist, and playwright, Langston Hughes was the leading voice of the Harlem Renaissance.
America was changing during the time that Langston Hughes was so popular. Black consciousness was becoming more and more public, more prominent. I think that Langston Hughes was important because he was one of the early figures to show the dignity and the beauty of ordinary Black life.
He was one of the most visible of the younger Black poets, a new generation that described themselves as the new Negro. They covered new topics, took on new poetic forms, and sought a wider audience, and Langston Hughes was at the forefront of that.
James Mercer Langston Hughes was born in Joplin, Missouri on February 1st, 1902.
He wrote a lot about being lonely when he was young, and I think that was a tremendous part of the product of moving around so much.
After graduating high school,
So just really quickly, a couple things, and you'll hear it a couple times in the future. There was something that kind of sounded like the N word, but it wasn't the N word. So I definitely don't feel comfortable saying it. But what I want you to realize, and he actually uses that sort of N word thing in one of his poems, that at the time, we're talking like 1920s, 1930s, that term was okay to use. Throughout the years, terms will change. For instance, I'm not sure if you know, like at one time, dumb. Dumb meant somebody couldn't talk, but then that word got twisted. So then it had to be changed to mute, or maybe something else. Right now, you might call them like vocally challenged or something like that. But as a term gets introduced and then it gets like morphed into something that it shouldn't be, we have to create new words for it. Like the R word, which, I definitely don't want to say that word. But at one time that was like kind of accepted, like, but then the meaning got twisted. So then we had to invent a new word that was like politically correct. So just know that word at its time in the 1920s, 1930s, it was okay. Then it got twisted, and then it had to be changed. So just wanted you to be aware of that. Okay. Play.
Hughes published his first and most famous poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers.
It is the first poem that celebrates Africa and dignifies the image of Africa in American literature.
The Negro Speaks of Rivers was published in a popular Black journal, and so he was really rather widely read from the beginning. His poetry and his prose actually had access to everyday people.
While studying at Columbia University, Hughes discovered the Harlem art scene, spending hours in jazz and blues clubs, weaving the rhythms of music into his work.
Jazz and blues were great influences on Langston Hughes. He sought to capture the energy and vitality of the music in his poetry.
He was very familiar with the Harlem nightlife. He knew the musicians, and later in his life, he would even collaborate with some of the key figures at that time, such as Duke Ellington.
Hughes was a prolific writer, and one.
All right, so prolific. That might be a word that would give you a little bit of trouble. It means he wrote a lot. Right now, one of my favorite authors is Stephen King, and a lot of people call him prolific because he comes out with a new book or two every year. Langston Hughes was also prolific. He wrote a lot. And there was a scene back there. You saw a picture of the Cotton Club, very famous in Harlem. A few movies have been made about the Cotton Club, but for jazz musicians in like the 20s and 30s, it was the place to be. Pretty iconic place in like Harlem Renaissance history. Also, really quickly flashed, Langston Hughes was holding a cigarette. So make sure that you don't smoke, and you'll see later on. I mean, who knows? Spoiler alert. Langston Hughes passes away, and it's because of cancer. But in a lot of his pictures, he is seen smoking. I mean, it was a different time, but just this is my public service announcement for you to not smoke. Don't smoke. Don't smoke.
And one of the first African-American authors who could support himself through his writing.
Langston Hughes wrote plays. He edited anthologies of poets of African descent across.
Anthology. Whenever you hear that in English class or wherever, it is a collection of different things from different authors. So if it's a poetry anthology, there will be an editor. So they said that Langston Hughes was an editor for this. So he is the one that collected it, organized it, but there were many different poets in this anthology. So an anthology is a collection of many different works, but there's usually a theme, like a short story anthology, or you could have an album. Not that there are many albums these days, but if it's music, you could have an album, and it would just mean that there were a collection of different artists, musicians on that one like record or CD or whatever. So you can have short story collections or anthologies. You can have poetry anthologies. You can have song anthologies. You really can't have anthologies of like novels just because they're just too big for a collection. So hard to go back and forth here.
Across the diaspora, he wrote short stories. One of his most famous series of short stories centers around Jesse B. Simple. These are tales told by.
Okay, they just showed the Apollo Club again, very famous. It's still going today. The Apollo, famous for like now comedians might play the Apollo.
A resident of Harlem to an aspiring writer who's a stand-in for Langston Hughes.
He was one of the more widely published of the young poets of the period. He was also among the better connected. He really worked hard to promote the careers of other young writers in Harlem and also throughout the rest of his life. That's also one of his big legacies.
Langston Hughes died of cancer
There's the
on May
cigarette.
22nd, 1967. His Harlem residence was given landmark status, a fitting tribute for a legendary writer.
His influence, his ambition as a creative writer, his success, his accessibility. He wrote for the average person. He was not writing for college classrooms. He was not writing for the elite. All of those things, I think, require that we recognize and acknowledge him as a great American literary voice of the 20th century.
We don't need to watch it again. So that is really brief. It's like 3 minutes of this is like 12 minutes because of course, I have to explain things. But I hope it gives you this little snapshot of Langston Hughes. We will dive further into his work, talk more about the Harlem Renaissance and some of the famous artists that came out of that. But right now, let's call that a lesson. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned a little something from it. And